able to participate in these seminars, which I think, as Lydia just said so well, there's a lot of questions that people who study the liberal arts and humanities often get. Cynical or skeptical, or at least somewhat ignorant or unknowing ones, that read something like, what are you going to do with that? And it's often not a mean-spirited question, because after all, we all find a way through life, and of course, put a roof over our heads and all that kind of necessary stuff. But at the end of the day, I think we can argue very powerfully that there's actually nothing more useful than that which enables you to live the one life you have in a way that you can make it count, that to you it is meaningful. And so these career life conversations on Fridays, which are, for those listening who may follow us online, entirely optional to our student, are really part of helping us think about how we navigate life. In the classroom, we're often reading Aristotle or Dante, we're parsing our Greek and all that kind of stuff. And all of those things, of course, redound and resound in all kinds of ways in our lives. But in the classroom, we're not necessarily asking the question about, well, how do I get a job? Or how do I present myself to the world? Or how do I think about the relationships in the healthiest, most positive and important way? How do I navigate my way through questions of religion and all those kinds of things? And so these career life conversations are meant to be an opportunity to kind of blow it open and ask anything that you as a human being at this point in time, the questions that you're asking, that you can ask those. And it really is, for me, just an enormous pleasure to have Greg Hurwitz and Jonathan Pageau here. They are friends of the college. They've both been here multiple times before. They both addressed their students to great acclaim and much adored in the past a number of times. They're also friends of each other. And one of the reasons it may not be the most obvious thing to bring an acclaimed writer and thriller novelist and comic book writer and screenwriter and all things. Greg has been together with this champion of the world of symbolism and theology, and yet at the same time they're in such powerful ways as I think their friendship attests, thinking about the same or similar questions and the stakes thereof. So with that said, I'm just going to, what I thought would be the most fun would just be to let the two of them engage in a conversation with all of you. Of course, we have formally entitled this Why We Tell Stories. I think that is the formal title of this session, though we don't have to stay confined to that already limitless question. We can go in any other directions, but you should feel free at any moment to jump in with the question that you'd most like to ask one or the other of both of these. Let's do it.
So how do we start? I'm thinking one of the things we could talk about, and this could be a question even to find out, is I have to agree, the way Stephen presented it, in some ways my friendship with Greg is a very surprising thing that's happened in the past few years. It's so surprising that even my wife at the beginning was like, why does this guy like you? Like, what is it? Like, it doesn't make sense that this Hollywood, kind of successful writer, why does he want to be friends with you? It doesn't make any sense. She's like, he must be some kind of CIA agent or something, like, yeah, I do something. And so maybe we could ask, the question I would ask is, why do we like each other? Like, what is it about? I can start.
You go first.
You go first. And so I think that, at first for me, Greg, he was involved in a lot of things that I was really interested in as a teenager. Like when I was young, he was writing comics. He was kind of in that world, a world that I had kind of set aside for a long time, but that he was deeply involved. And I was so curious to find out about this guy. Like, he's writing Batman. Like, that was like my childhood hero. That's how it started. But then I quickly realized that he had like a natural insight about storytelling. And because of that, a kind of natural insight about human nature that really, woke me up. So he has, you hear him talking about, he perceives, you guys don't know, but he's watching all of you. He can kind of perceive things in very subtle ways. And that insight to me was really refreshing. And for me, at least, it started there. And then just spending time together at some point, realizing that we're in such different camps. But for some reason, there are these places where it bridges. Some of it is storytelling. Some of it I think is just a kind of intuition. And And so that would be the beginning of that. I don't know what your insight on that is.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. I mean, it's a little bit awkward now for me to confess that I actually am a CIA agent. My interest in you is being part of the Christian nationalist movement.
There you go.
Look, for me, I think I'm very much governed by the instinct for what is maximally curious and shiny and
Absolutely.
engaging for me.
That is
So
the
everything
meaning
I
of
did,
life.
Undergraduate, I studied English and psychology. Like, I only went into arenas that were maximally compelling. And the same thing for me is true for friendships, and friendships are a kind of attraction. And I think that the first level that I connected with you is you're a true artist. And even if your art is something that in some ways seems on an opposite pole of what I do, like you're doing like these beautiful carvings that are that the symbology is foremost, and they're iconic and archetypal and deeply resonant from symbol down. And you know, when I'm writing, everything has to grow up from specifics. I can't write a novel that's good if I think I'm writing a novel about the triumph of the human spirit. Everything I think about is what's a line of dialogue, what's an action scene, what's a way that some little detail is illuminating about character. Is there somebody on the subway across from my character who, you know, has a worn pair of black loafers filled in with magic marker because they can't afford to buy new shoes? Like, it's all comes from the specifics and the details. And I'm much more geared towards words, and you're obviously you're immensely visual. And so the first thing was, in my conversations with you, it was just evident that there was nothing about you that was dogmatic or propagandistic or rigidly ossified ideological. You're sort of a living, breathing embodiment of what it is to be an artist, and that is suffused with your work and your belief system. And I didn't really have orthodoxy. I'm from a very, let's just say, a much more liberal, secular Jewish background initially. My parents sent me to Jesuit high school. So I have a lot of affinity for Catholics. I have a lot of friends who are evangelicals, but I didn't know a lot about the Orthodox church. And so I was captivated by you. Like, meeting you is sort of like, you know, it's like winning the lottery the first time you buy a ticket in terms of a point of ingress for that field, because there's so much in it that is, it's such a muscular belief system, and there's so much darkness that's incorporated, and there's so much nuance, and there's so much texture. And I think the way that informs your thinking and your grounding, and then your art and the reasons why you do things, is very, very solid. And I think that solidity is something that, you know, we talk all the time and overuse the word fractal, but it's true. Like, you have your artistic integrity is aligned by dint of what you do with your belief in your faith and your character. And in a lot of ways, you know, if all people are hypocritical in certain regards because we're humans, you have the least aspect of that in your persona and your dealings. And so, you know, I always say, so Jordan Peterson, I go back quite a long way. He was my thesis advisor when I was an undergraduate, so I've known him a very long time. But I've said to him before, I say, Pajot is a holy person. It's so annoying. You know, and when there's arguments or disputes, there's just a real solidity. And I think in a lot of ways I'm more exploratory. You're very grounded in what you think, and everything's really bolted down to the earth. And so, you know, we've been working on a project together recently, and that's been captivating to work on a narrative project, because it's sort of like meeting in the middle from these two sides.
Yeah. I mean, that's what's so fascinating too, is that, so Greg and I think it was last year, I don't remember how the idea started. We kind of had this idea that we could, because I really believe that nobody has been able to create a narrative version of Genesis. Like, no one's ever been able to do it. It's always extremely cringy and, you know, tacky, and you see two naked people in a garden and you're just like, what is this? This is not possible. And so we kind of gave ourselves this challenge to dramatize Genesis. And we started just exchanging and working together. And I was really surprised. I was curious to see how that would go. But it's as if it just went as well as you could imagine. Like, everything just kind of flowed together. And when we finally were sitting in the same room, everything was just coming together in ways that was just was astounding. And I think we cracked it. Like, I think we actually were able to do it, to tell the story of the fall and of creation and of all of this in a way that is actually narratively compelling. And I think it does have to do in some ways like in the, because the way that Greg writes, he would be like, he has this thing, does this hands, he's like reaching, he's like grasping for
I
something.
do?
Yeah, you do this thing, like you're like grasping, you're like, and then you have this like image here, like a finger with paint. You remember that? He's like, he sees this image, and it's like, where is this coming from? Like, what is this? And then he kind of scratching at it. And then when it comes together, you're like, oh, yeah, that makes total sense.
Exactly.
Because you're really coming at it from the ground up in that sense. Like
Absolutely.
it's true that I'm more top down. I see the structure, and I'm like, this is how it should be. But that is also can be kind of cold, right? In terms of you want to have something that's narratively compelling, and you have like this kind of almost like really think you're imagining, you know, like dirt and the, you know, the leaves hitting their legs, and you have this kind of really ground up approach.
Well, it's not, yeah, I mean, part of what we want to do is really show this, tell the story in a way that's humanizing, tell the story in a way that's psychological. So what's it really like if you've never felt pain the first time you feel pain? Like, how angry is Adam at Eve, given his sort of cringy blame of her for being the cause of his downfall the first night that they're alone? What happens the first time she offers him an apple in the fallen world? What happens the first time you see her in blood if you've never seen blood? And how does that insurmountable trauma, it's like one of the greatest traumas that's imaginable, right? How do you tell that as a story of intergenerational trauma that gets passed on to
Yes.
Cain and Abel, right? And
That's
that-
imaginable
there's
if you
there's a
recall
flow
our
for how this
childhood.
moves, that if it's in the psychological, then we feel like we're on narrative pacing and narrative footing. And I think part of this is, when I talked about you being an artist, is sort of one of the first things that I was drawn to. This kind of collaboration wouldn't work if there was ideology or dogma or ego where best idea doesn't win, right? Or all those things. Or if things are really graspy. I've had a couple movies made and some TV, and one of the things that you realize is that production, when you get to production or creative collaboration, it's like a marriage. It's either getting better or worse. It's never stable. And if you have the right tempo and you set the right value structure, which is the best idea wins, and the project is elevated above individual needs or ego, right? Like the actors who always pull you aside, like, I just think I need some more lines here, right? Like you're servicing their ego all the time. If you get those alignments are correct, what happens is it can elevate exponentially. Everything feels like a double trampoline bounce of creative exaltation. And when it goes wrong, you know, you're the screenwriter, then all of a sudden you feel like you're the drunk asshole behind a bar at 4 a.m. with like a broken bottle, fending people off to protect your script. It's like going to shit. And there's no, it's going one way or the other. And I feel like there was this alignment we had where there's not a lot of jousting and other stuff that's the noise, right? So I have these images, and there's sometimes where Jonathan will be like, no, that doesn't work at all. Like, that's completely sacrilegious and will offend everyone in the Orthodox Church. I'm like, okay, sorry, we'll just leave that. But, you know, but there's a working within it where you want to grab the thing and have it kind of shine.
Yeah.
And so that interplay where there's not offense, there's only sort of artistic integrity being brought to this, that's what you're sort of looking for. And in a way, it's a microcosm of what you want in your lives as you pursue whatever fields you pursue, whatever relationships you pursue, whatever careers you pursue. You want to be pursuing the thing that seats you most fully in your discipline, in your art, in your craft. And
Yes.
those crafts have different sets of ethics that have to hold above all else.
Yes.
You know, one of the things we've seen is this subversion to individual ethic to the political, where it's like, I'm not a church, I'm really pro-politics. I'm not a school, I'm really ideological, right? I'm not a writer who entertains, I need to create propaganda. And you have to adhere to the ethic of the individual crafts that you're doing, and that's a meeting place. And so that's something that you learn and uphold, and then that will inform anything that you dig into all the way. Contains the whole secret of the universe. Like anything that you apply to, you could be a jeweler, you could be a
Absolutely.
veterinarian, you could be a computer scientist, you could be an
100%.
artist, you could be a teacher. If you give your full devoted
You'll
focus
be
to
redeemed.
something and you go all the way down and you watch what its reach is,
Yes.
it contains the same information, right? And then I think part of the aim is, do
Absolutely.
you embody or go close towards the top of one dominant hierarchy of achievement and meaning, right? And then if you get another, all of a sudden you start to have almost like a pattern recognition that seems preternatural,
Absolutely.
that you can anticipate things ahead. and then you can add more things along the way. And I think that if our meeting place is for a place that's artistically pure, it also means you're very rounded and lined out and squared away in your overall belief system and your understanding of your place in the world. And so we can create together then, because you're not bringing in a bunch of friction and static from other things that you have a need to feed.
Yeah. That's it. I think you've brought a lot of interesting insights. You know, one of the things that I realized while you were speaking is when you're doing the right thing, there always has to be the right balance of difficult and easy.
Yes.
In the sense that when something is so, how can I say this? Like when something, I imagine this is something you're going through, because learning Greek is obviously not easy. But there's a sense in which you're putting in effort, but there's also a flow, like a natural flow that you fall into, and it carries you through. And what you end up with is like joy. You end up with joy and more energy and more possibility. And I think that a lot of that has to do with disposition, like what you're saying. Basically, you just have to be disposed in the right way, and you have to be attentive to what's happening. And so, you know, I think that that's also one of the things that was happening with us. And so we're coming from two completely different worlds, but we are attentive to the other person, attentive to what's happening, kind of open to, like you said, not holding on to ego, not trying to make sure that this one thing fits in. And then we work through it, and it's almost like you're just going downstream almost.
Yes.
Right? It's just kind of carrying you through. And I think that all the things that I've been involved in that have been successful have been like that, where it's hard. Like maybe you're poor, maybe you still struggle, you're trying to make things fit together, but there's something that's just carrying you, and it produces more joy at the end.
Absolutely.
Even though it's difficult, you know.
We talked about this a little bit last night. I don't know any writers who are successful, whether it's novelists or screenwriters, where the writing isn't a compulsion. It's almost like it's a good illness.
Absolutely.
Right? And part of what you're striving for in your varied endeavors is to figure out the thing that you're compelled to do.
Absolutely.
To figure out the thing that, and it doesn't mean that it's always this way and it's magical and the heavens open up and the muse is, bleeding on a trumpet. But for the most part, when you're doing what you're meant to do, you want to feel compelled. And when I'm writing well, it's harder for me to not write than to write. And whatever that thing is for you, that's the daemon that you want to pursue and follow. You want to follow a source of a compulsion, that you have to do something and that you have to know more about it and you have to get better at it. And that's true in any field.
Yeah, the craftsman, there's a saying that you can't pull the craftsman away from his craft. Like, it's actually difficult, because the person, like when I'm not carving a lot of icons now, but when I was carving icons, it's like
you don't have a choice.
5 o'clock, and I need to go back. I need to go back to my family, but and just another 10, just another, and you're just like, this is opening up, and this is doing that, and like that feeling is obviously you do have to stop and go, and do the other thing, but that sense of like, no, you're just being carried is really important.
My wife and daughter have something when I say it'll be 10 minutes. They'll go, your 10 minutes or my 10 minutes?
That's right.
With work. Yeah, it's really interesting as you're trying to kind of figure out your way to that. You can see which things shine and which things call to you. I mean, one of the things that I think is very important, and it's highly relevant to Ralston. None of you are getting degrees. Like, you'd all be way better off going to community college and getting a degree in graphic design if you're worried about employment, right? Or immediate, easy employment after a degree. But one of the things that you're doing is you're not being trained for that. You're being trained for being artists and entrepreneurs and philosophers and
alive
leaders and soldiers and innovators. And there's such a temptation when I go on book tour. I have a lot of people come up to me and say, yeah, I really want to be a novelist. I want to be a novelist, but who could do that with money? I had to make a living, right?
Yeah.
So I've been an accountant for 30 years, but I'm going to retire, and then then I'm going to really do it because I had a family, and how are you supposed to do it? And I always think, like, how do you exist in the world that you have a notion that all of your enthusiasm and all of the youthful drive that you have early, you can just pause that and do something else for 30 years and then just pick it up again as if you haven't been altered. And so part of what's happening with you, and there's an environment around Ralston that is truly, I think, magical. There's an environment here, there's a quality of people here. We were sitting down and I said to Jonathan, I said, everyone, the Ralston student is so incredibly varied, but there's a sort of look still, right? For this is the third class that I've met, second, that you just see there's like an energy around it. And part of it is you have to be the keeper of that. I still remember the guy in a bar my senior year. The Bow and Arrow was like the local kind of shitty bar at my college, and he was back for graduate week. He said, what do you want to do to graduate? I said, what I really want to do is be a novelist. Well, keep your day job, right? There's so much of this sneering, you'll join me in the real world soon enough.
Yeah.
And part of it is you want to shelter the enthusiasm that you have right now, like a pilot light. You want to shelter that, and you want to hold it, and you don't want to worry too much about. If you put your faith in pursuing the thing that's of interest to you, obviously you're here, so you're exceptional in a bunch of ways that don't make a whole lot of sense, probably, because that's the selection process. And you want to be able to shelter that as you move and continue to grow that, and not take measures that are expedient and say, well, but I need. And that doesn't mean you don't live in the real world. You don't have to figure it out. You don't need to pay rent. You don't need to get jobs and take care of who you need to take care of and see your responsibilities.
Yeah.
But that thing is so important. It's the most important thing that you can do is to shelter that.
Yeah. I totally agree. The truth is, I probably shouldn't say this, but the truth is that our world right now is the best world possible in which to be poor. It's actually like it's not that bad to be poor, because there's everything is there to prevent you from starving, which is pretty much all you need. You just need to not starve and make sure that that you don't have rain falling on your head. If you can figure that out, then the world is open,
True.
And every time someone asks me about becoming an artist, that's one of the first questions I ask them is like, are you willing to be poor? And that doesn't mean that you will be, but you have to be willing to.
Absolutely.
And that's okay. And it's hard because there's pressure. Like there's pressure from your family, there's pressure all around, people saying, well, you're not being responsible, you're not doing the right thing. Forget that. Like actually you have to ignore that. If you're healthy, somewhat healthy, and you're eating and you're staying, you have a roof, at least when you're like in your 20s, you're good. That's good to go. And you have the time now and the space to develop the big questions that you have. Because that, for some people it doesn't, but for a lot of people, as you get older, that space runs out. Like it runs out, the capacity to ask the big question just kind of gets taken up by the worries of the world.
Unless
but
you feed it.
Yeah.
You have to practice it,
Yeah.
or it atrophies.
Yeah. And like you said, I meet people all the time that are exactly the way that you said. They come up to you and they said, when I was in my 20s, I wanted to be an artist, but now I'm so-and-so. And there's just like gray in their eyes, like a drab thing. And I keep thinking, well, why didn't you just do it? Like what? Well, you got to pay the bills, you got to do that. I would say, I don't know, but I think Greg is right in seeing that the fact that you're even here shows that you already understand some of that, and the weirdest thing about it is all the people that will criticize you, and I've experienced this myself, all the people that criticized my family when we were like dirt poor with 3 kids, like just barely making it, they forgot that now. They forgot that that's how they saw me now, and now they're just like, oh wow, it's so great, you're successful. It's like, yeah, but you were totally like family, even though you were totally judging us and having this kind of disdain towards us, and now you're like this. It's kind of funny. So it's like, don't worry about that stuff. Not too. Yeah, it's not worth it.
Yeah.
Can I jump in and
Yeah.
ask a question? Why do you two think you feel compelled to create stories, whether that's through imagery or words? What is it, if you could put a word to it, that defines or describes that compulsion?
Well, for me, part of it is a novel's the only time I get to speak for 400 pages without being interrupted. Pot kettle. I think it's weird for me. me, it's almost like, you know, for those of you who have a habit of working out, you know, when you don't work out, you just feel all plugged up and not right in the world. If I'm not writing, if I don't write properly rough draft writing, I don't feel good. It's almost like it's like the sun to a plant. It's just a huge part of how I express myself. And I always wrote. I mean, when I was a kid, I loved reading. My parents didn't let me watch television, and I read the entire young adult section of our library by fifth grade. I was reading Stephen King, and I thought anybody who loves stories. My sister is a fanatical reader. I thought anybody who loves stories would want to write stories. I just thought, because, you know, we're in our own little world, or we're looking at through our own weird kaleidoscope. And I was like, if you love stories, why wouldn't you want to write stories? Isn't that the coolest thing anyone could ever do? I remember asking my sister, who's now a, you know, clinical professor of pediatric gastroenterology, like, when are you going to start your book? When she was in like 7th grade, she's like, I don't want to write. I just like reading now, you know. You know, there's things that we like. So it's so weird. It's so integral to who I am and how I function and how I see the world and how I think. I think in stories. I think in words. I've even had really weird dreams when I was deep editing. I had a dream one time that the dream was in Microsoft Word and I was editing the dream. And then I had another dream that was a nightmare that I was walking through and something came out. I was walking through a dark house and something came out and scared me. And a jump scare is always like the cheapest thing in movies, right? And so I thought, well, this would actually be a lot scarier if I had suspense first. So I like rewound the dream and had like bloody footprints too, so that the tension mounted, so that when the scare happened, I was more scared. And so I think I'm very hardwired. It's like a calling for me, really.
I think that for me, you know, the secret is, I really believe this, that we have rhetoric, we have politics, we have economy, mathematics, we have all these ways of knowing and of seeing, and we have science. But underneath that, art is actually underneath it all, which is that story making.
above.
There's three, I think. There's the making of space, that is architecture. There's the making of the story and the making of the image. And those three, they are the secret binding for everything else. Everything else exists within that world. And it's like almost like an esoteric secret. That is that if you can control the story, if you can tell the story, then you're actually changing the way people see and think about the world before they have any opinion. And so that's why that's why I love fairy tales so much. That's why I love the Bible stories. That's why I love myth, because that's what those stories are there to do. And, you know, and there's a sense in which in the last few decades, I would say that the story making element of our society was colonized or was parasitized by ideological strains. And that has an effect. Like, it actually changes the way people see the world. People don't even realize it. They're seeing the world through these new stories. And so it's exposing, I hope you can see how important the story is. That is, that how you frame the world in which you live. And now is the time to tell stories again, right? It really is, because everything is shaking and everything is kind of in flux and we don't know what's going to happen. And it's kind of wild. Anything's possible. But it also means that those that plant the right stories now, they will be the ones giving the direction. And so can we be the ones that tell stories that are true, that aren't captured, that aren't ideological, but are true in the sense that they have the most reality in it? And so I think that's why I'm so fascinated by stories and image making. You know, I can't be an architect, it's too complicated. But like the stories and the image making, you know, it's like I just want to be involved because I know that now is the moment.
There's a tendency when things are moving a certain way, and I think, like, just to put a label on it, let's call it increasing postmodernism, right? To think that progress is better than not progress, number one, there's a value judgment, but also that the right side of history is always on the side of the way that momentum is going. And obviously we're seeing that in a lot of cases where that's gone too far into a kind of insanity. And when I think about the way that storytelling has changed, it ripples throughout all of the professions across everything. So you think just 20th century, so you have The Sound and the Fury by Faulkner, right? Which one story that's told from 4 perspectives. One of them's a retarded brother. There's different siblings in one family. You have Rashomon, right? Which is the movie, Kurosawa movie, where it's one story told from 4 perspectives. You have Cubism, right? What's a nude look like descending a staircase? It's an image of a woman in 16 different dimensions all at once. You have theory of relativity, where all of a sudden science starts asking those questions. Even in psychology, you have a shift in perspective of Freud sitting, smoking his pipe while the patient lays and stares up at his own, the abyss of his own unconscious,
Yes.
versus Rogers, who sits someone up and looks them in the eye. There's a perspective shift that happens. And all those things are very interesting and compelling. They're movements towards examining and exploring different modes of perception, right? And obviously, theologically, you can talk about all the ways that happen. But when they go too far, what happens is the form begins to elevate over the function,
Absolutely.
right? So all of a sudden, it's what's the most fragmented something can be? What's the most diabolical?
It becomes
disintegrated
a parody
parts?
of
Then you get
itself.
Dadaist poetry, you get urinals hanging on walls of museums as works of art, right? You get the thing that's sort of absurd, and it becomes an intellectual exercise that's focused around it. And I think that pendulum swing has gone far enough into this direction that's so sort of intellectually masturbatory that now there's going to be a time for a resetting and a bringing together again of form and function in a way that the form has to suit it. It's something can be a
Absolutely.
really cool trick once. We were talking about Pollock last night, Jackson Pollock. Something can be amazing if somebody does it once or innovative or new, but if you keep moving in that direction, what you have is a complete shattered mosaic of different impulses, all of which are individual cries of self-expression.
Yeah, and there's also, if you think about how, let's say you have a story, right? You have the identity of something that's encompassed in an image and a story, and there's room in that story on the edges of it to question it, to poke at it, right? To create ironic commentary on the story, and it's actually completely coherent. You see that all through history, right? If you think of Ovid's Metamorphosis, like that's what Ovid was doing in the 1st century, right? He was basically deconstructing his own mythological tradition. And so there's room for all of those things within the tradition, but we've come to a point, we've also limited the idea of what it is to be a cultured person to that deconstruction, right? And that's obviously runs out. At some point it just runs, it falls into like fragmentation and just breaks apart into a million pieces. And there are moments when it's actually time to recast the story, right? To rediscover the center, to kind of come back to what is the shining light that later someone will deconstruct for sure. And so I think that that's the greatness of the moment now, is that I think this is possible because in some ways we now have the fertilizer of the decomposed, cynical narrative in which to plant a seed of authenticity.
There's a lot, like psychopaths and fraudmen will shortcut the process and just pick up, like, I like Jackson Pollock, I'll flick paint on the wall. And we forget, if you look at Picasso's early work, he's a staggering traditional painter, right? It's not like he just all of a sudden made a face on a napkin and everyone lost their minds. So there's something about, I wrote my 8th novel has a sort of a bit of a meta element to it, that there's a crime writer who gets accused of a crime and he has to write the story of what's happening to him and edit the story, which is the investigation that he's solving. But if it was all meta, all it is a parlor trick, right? It's pick a card. And so in a way, not that there's ever mastery of an art form, but you want to be as close to mastery of what everything is before you take that and you start to twist it and play with it.
Absolutely.
And I remember when I wrote a very profoundly mediocre rough draft of my first novel, I started very young, I was 19, but when my first agent asked, who I eventually did 16 rewrites with before we sold it, we said, what is it? It's like, well, it's kind of an action thriller, but it's a parody of an action thriller, and it's a this, and it's like, you can't do 8 things at once. Like, what section of the bookstore does it go in? Like, accomplish that first, right? And if you can accomplish something that's within and that's part of what you're doing, a lot of what you're doing with this master's program, is you want to get an expert grasp of the essentials, and then you want to grow and embody those things, and then you can start to play and innovate within the form. But if you just skip straight to innovation, there's no discipline in that. There's no responsibility. There's no
Absolutely.
tradition you're standing on to sort of proclaim things to higher heights.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it ends up becoming flatter and flatter and just more and more shallow as the cynicism increases and as the comment upon comment, it's
Because it's more about you. It's more about your own narcissistic self-expression than a tradition that you've embodied.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I think that's what this is right now is the right time to be doing that. And what's amazing about what Ralston's doing and for you guys is as people are running away, as a lot of the institutions are running away from the foundational stories that have brought us where we are, you'll have like a jewel that a lot of people don't have. It's like a treasure, really, is what it is. And this is actually the exciting moment of being at the end of something, or at the moment when it's kind of falling apart. Is you're like, you're like in Lord of the Rings or some fantasy novel where people have forgotten the tales of the kings, and now nobody knows who they are, and someone finds this grimoire, and inside there's like the secret history of their own people. It's like, actually, this is what we're going through right now. Like, you guys have the chance to do that. Nobody, people aren't reading the text that you're reading. They're not going into the tradition anymore. And so you'll have, you actually will have, a treasure that will illumine. And you can feel it, like, when people hold that treasure, like, people who have a good knowledge of history, or people that have a good knowledge of literature, it informs their conversation. And when they're speaking, they don't have to reference directly the literature or the history, but everything they say will have an extra weight because even just in their mind, they know that they're standing on something that isn't just 50 years old. It isn't just like the last fashionable theory that people are grabbing onto.
There's a moral responsibility in coming out of here to not just live up to your learning, but also to be interesting. That's a moral responsibility to follow what is engaging to you and to be interesting in the world, because that's infectious.
Yes.
And that's a really important part of it to think about. Like, it's a treasure to be able to spend a year the way that you're spending it. It's incredibly rare, and you're going to have something other people don't have. And for years, my biggest frustration has been the people who are sort of semi-educated, right? You have the degree, you have the viewpoints, you have your 6 sources of expertise, and everything's sort of rigid and ossified, right? You know what you think about everything, and you go to these dinner
So you
parties
don't think
sometimes,
about
or
anything.
used to, where everything that everybody says you could write for them in advance. You know all of their perspectives. You know what their opinion's going to be on everything. And we see this increase. It's like watching MSNBC versus Fox News. Like, there's never going to be a startling revelation of incredible nuance, some received wisdom that they're accommodating and assimilating. And there's a complacency within the prevailing academic world right now, and there's not a living fire in it. And so part of it is when you can wield that as a living thing, you're wielding fire, and there's an incredible amount of power that you're going to have that you can bring to things, and it's going to give you pause when you're approaching something to stop and step back into, what do you really think? What is really going to be the highest and best good or engagement with something? And you can figure out ways to innovate and ways to alter and ways to kind of shatter through a lot of the codified corruption, whether that's intellectual or moral, that's around things. You figure out ways to do things differently.
When the two of you look back on your 20s, what do you think you did well, and what do you know now in hindsight was something to learn from, something to alter course when you were older?
I mean, my 20s were a time of massive change, like just complete 180 change in my life. So it's hard to know, how it could have happened. For sure, I went to art school and I finished, I think I was the first in my program, but I was also, it was not where I should have been. And I kind of knew that once I was looking back. I was like, there were things showing me that this was not for me. And then at my last evaluation, the professor that was in charge of me, she said, this is at the end of my degree. she said, Jonathan, don't worry, you're getting all A's. Like, everything's okay. But I just wanted to tell you that you really don't belong here. And she said, really, why don't you like go to seminary or something? Like, you don't belong here. And she was absolutely right. I was in my 20s. I was like cocky, so I was like, yeah, whatever. But she was absolutely right. And so I would say that that's something. But it's weird because in some ways you end up recuperating it, because my understanding of postmodernism and my understanding of contemporary art has been extremely useful for me, because I know what I'm standing against, not completely against, but I know what I'm standing against, and then also wanting to incorporate just enough of it into my stance so that I'm breathing, right? So it's not just this ossified weird thing that I'm just reacting to it and now I'm against it. So but maybe I could have done that without spending, like 4 years. Like, maybe that's possible.
No.
I mean, I think the one thing I definitely had like in the NFL they call it motor. Like I had the work ethic to because I knew that my job, this career would take a lot of luck, and I think of luck as a hatch is going to open in the ceiling of where you are, and you got to be ready to go through. So you got to be flapping against that ceiling no matter what. And it's all I wanted to do. And it's funny, you talk about being broke. I graduated college, and my roommates were going on to be like iBankers and lawyers and doctors, and everyone was making, like starting salary $120,000, which sounded like $11 billion. And I wanted to be a novelist, and so I kind of stalled. I did a year I won a fellowship. I did a year at Oxford, Masters in Shakespeare and Tragedy, just to have a very practical degree in case my primary career as a novelist didn't pan out. But I was just working, and I said at the time, if somebody could come up to me and say, we'll write you a check, you could have $2,500 a month for the rest of your life, and you can live in a studio and you can just write full time.
Oh my
I would
God.
have taken that deal.
Yeah.
Now I'm elated that I did it at this point. But, it's all I wanted to do. And so I think I had the work ethic, and I also had, at some point, for whatever reason, and it's weird, I'm from a family of, doctors and lawyers and sort of traditional professionals. For some reason, I had the awareness to break from everything and risk everything on myself and just say, this is what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
And even when I finished, I was pretty fortunate. I sold my first book. I was fairly young, but whenever I did a job, it was like, how do I make the most money the quickest so that I can still have 35 hours a week to write?
Mm-hmm.
Like everything was geared around that. Even when I did my first deal, I thought if I live on that aforementioned $2,500 a month, how many months do I have in the bank to keep writing? Because it's all I wanted to do. And if you're a doctor and you have a bad, stretch financially, you don't have to then go be the janitor or take another job, right? But as a writer, if you mismanage that, you lose the time to do the thing that you love and that feeds you. And I'd say, the things that I learned, it's hard because now I'm just on the back half of 50, I'm 51. And so there's this awareness of, I can look back and have some sadness distinct from regret about the things I didn't know earlier. But without me going through them and bumbling through them, there's no way that I could have integrated to reach the knowledge that I have to then look back at them. So it's a very weird thing to not be grievancy or resentful or remorseful, but to also just look with sadness at some things that I might have missed at earlier stages. And I think some of that was I probably earlier on, it was hard to figure out the balance of how much you go for and grab and reach for, and how much when you do that it recedes. So later in life, I think I figured out a lot more about that. Like even just in interacting, let's say with Hollywood, like at one point, my book series is called Orphan X, and at one point I'd adapted it in a few huge ways for a few huge movie stars who had lost to other projects, and it was sort of seen about the town. And I remember my manager calling me about 3 years ago, and saying like, well, the series has been seen, and so for Hollywood, they're not sure. Even if it didn't get made for reasons that I lost these stars, but I had, these big deals, and it didn't move forward. I said, no problem. Tell everyone it's not for sale. She was like, what? I said, just take it off the market completely. Like, I'm not selling it. I know where the series is going. I have a lot of confidence in the track record, and we just pulled it back. She said, okay. And the first inquiries that came in, it was like, no, he's not selling it. And so, a year and a half later, we had 7, 8 interested parties. We had 4 studios bidding, and we steered into the right deal. And there's something in not, if you reach for something too much, it recedes. but you need a confidence to not. And figuring out that toggle, I couldn't have done this when I was 24 writing my third novel, right? Like you can't do it ahead of time, but that's a balance that is something that I think it would have been lovely to know how to manage those things with, I think, perhaps a little bit more grace and displaying even less need.
Yeah.
And I already started with an advantage with that because, you know, I was a full-fledged novelist before I joined Hollywood with screenwriting and then TV and then comics. So I never needed it fully, but there is something about this sort of flow of work and letting things go and leaving them open there's a kind of gracefulness that I think I'm only starting to learn over the last years.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Let's open up for your questions, guys. And I will give you the letter. David?
Looks like we covered meaning in life and career.
What has been the experience? Okay, what has been the experience for you and your families emerging as more public personalities, and how have you grappled with that? In addition to the responsibility that I feel like you both have and the interest that you have to contribute to human society and the world.
Yeah, for me it's been more recent. Like you, it's been kind of this just kind of progressive, knows what I'm doing, and it's kind of increasing. I would say it's like a 50-50, it's a 50-50 thing. On the one hand, you know, it's great. You know, there's something, you know, my kids, I think my kids are proud of what I'm doing. Like they like their dad, like they're proud of their dad. And to me, that's really cool. I love that because you could have teenagers that are really embarrassed of their dad. It's like, you know, it's like want to shy away. So that has been for me like a great joy. But, you know, I also, it's harsh, you know, because you're married and you have kids and so you're traveling. And the perception of the public, you know, your wife knows that it's like, some of it is bullshit. Like, you know, it's like you're also this grumpy Jonathan that wakes up in the morning and doesn't want to talk to me. Or like, you're also like this other thing that is less pleasant than the one that everybody sees. And so I think that sometimes, at least I feel that, you know, like there can be a bit of an annoyance that everybody would come up to you and imagine your, imagine my wife, someone comes up to me and says, wow, how amazing is it to be married to Jonathan Peugeot? And she's like, okay, whatever. It's like, Jonathan Peugeot.
Like his only friends are CIA people.
Exactly. It's like, if only you knew, you know. So that's been one of the downsides. I've been trying to compensate, it's like trying to bring them with me as much as I can, to travel with me and to kind of do the things with me. But it's definitely.
I can hear even more about how.
Yeah, exactly. But there is definitely a challenging aspect to that because it takes up a lot of space. You know.
I'd say for me, I did. You know, it was weird. I had a good amount of success early, like by 23, 24. I'm very glad that when my career started, like, I mean, I had a website, but it wasn't online. I got to acclimate a little bit more as things progressed. My wife grew up in a Hollywood family in that environment, and so she had, like, her grandmother figure was Lucille Ball, and her first memory is Groucho Marx rocking her. And what's funny is when we met, I was like, oh, I gotta go to this agent. I was still kind of like younger about a Hollywood guy. Like, I gotta go to my agent part. And she was like, she was just so, if there was arrogance or vanity or gatekeeping, she just was so, this wasn't the world she grew up in. You know, she grew up going to like Sammy Davis Jr.'s parties where it was just like welcoming and everyone was great. And it was all the real side of things. And so I think for her, engaging with me then at a lower level and seeing like big showy agents being great at parties was completely not of interest. And it was amazing for me. I think we're similar in that we both married women who don't care whatsoever about like material stature.
Yeah.
Like there's like zero concern. And, you know, initially it was a little annoying because I was like, wow, I'm trying to figure it out. And like this guy invited us over and he's the, you know, president of this star's company and we have to do it. And she was like, if you don't like the person, who can? And of course it's all right in hindsight, like anything that was too grabby. It's funny, I was at a party and I still like going to a premiere or going to like parties like now and then, but I was with a friend of mine who's a prominent South African actor, and we were looking around and there's some of the same faces I remember from when I was 24 at the parties. Everyone's just older, they're higher up in the studio, they're more famous actors, and we were having a laugh about like, God, remember going to this where Like you'd go around and like collect business cards and be like, oh, like we're gonna, and like nothing ever comes of any of that. You know, and so that was really helpful, I think, for part of the process that I talked about earlier of learning to not press or not, you know, move in and think that you need to do something. And it's so funny, I settled at a younger age into a real relationship within community among, let's say, Hollywood or publishing or wherever I move, where it's all genuine friendships with quirky, brilliant, creative people. Like that's all that matters, right? It doesn't, none of it matters in a way that is expedient. This is a useful relationship. And so, and then once you're in that space, it just kind of proliferates out.
Absolutely.
So I'd say that the older that I get, but my wife had a significant role in that too, the more comfortable that it is in a lot of ways. And in terms of responsibility, in a lot of ways, what's interesting is the responsibility part comes, I think for me, it's twofold. One of them is, you know, I've written 25 novels, right? I've been at it a while. And I'm the co-president of a group called International Thriller Writers. And we have like 6 billion books in print, right? We have Patterson and Grisham, like we have everybody as part of this group. And I've been the co-president. And so we've been able to take a lot of these steps with relative little effort. I mean, it definitely is effort and thought, but like the amount that we can help people significantly at certain key junctures when they want to be helped and when they're the right people to help is just unbelievable. And so that there is definitely a different responsibility in terms of turning some corner and then recognizing that like all the people who helped me along the way when I was young and in my 20s and as arrogant as you, with your art teacher, like you can do that and you can guide, and there's a real joy in that to be able to have that. And the other thing really is, you know, in large part because of my affiliation and close friendship with Jordan, I've been more and more public, and then in a lot of ways I've done some spelunking into the culture to try and pull the Democrats back from the far left. We did Exodus together, Jonathan and I and Stephen, and we did the Gospels on Daily Wire. There's been a lot of very public facing things, and I think in the face of that, I have felt more responsibility to hold a kind of center and to be truthful, but also very intensely not to be reactive and become part of a political system or the culture wars or all these things, but to try to be an adult. Like there's an age you get to where you kind of look around and you go, things are a mess, and like we're sort of the grown-ups now, right? How are we going to handle this? Like, and so there is some responsibility from that part of it that comes with trying to adhere to a higher set of standards for myself because it's important, and a lot of that has to do with speaking the actual truth as I feel it, but not also overcompensating and becoming angry or screamy or pushy in a way that then allows for resistance.
Yeah, I love what you said about also like non-instrumentality. I think this is something that like Stephen has really made me think about. Like I think that naturally I don't tend to think that way, but especially as you become more known or like more in the public sphere, that you have to be more aware of that question. It's like, why am I in relationship with this person? And is it just because it's going to, it's like you find yourself in this weird position where you're like meeting billionaires, you know, and then you're like, well, why am I talking to this person? Is it just because they have a lot of money? Is that the reason why I'm talking to them? Or is there something else? Like, is there some interesting conversation? I mean, these successful people often are sharp and intelligent, and so it's interesting to talk to them. But what's the reason? And so I found myself becoming more sensitive to that and trying to question my relationships in ways and thinking, like, why am I pursuing this person, or why am I engaging with them? And that's definitely been a lesson. And I know Stephen has been great because he's in our discussions about these questions is always insisting, like, the best world always comes from non-instrumental. Like if you treat people with a genuine curiosity and you meet people that are genuinely interesting and just engage with them, that in the end what will come out of it will actually be better than if you were trying to figure out like how can I get something or partner with this person to do something. And that's the same thing. Like Greg and I in some ways became friends. We wouldn't have thought at the outset to like write something together, but we just started talking and becoming friends, and all of a sudden I was like, hey, this makes sense. Like maybe let's try this. And then out of that comes something that I think is fruitful because it's not built on, you know, like, oh, he's got contacts here and like let's use his contacts to, you know, get this done or whatever.
Yeah, beware the plan that you like sort of push and manipulate and grasp your way to, because then you have it.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, you know, people don't necessarily, all the parties in that aren't all rowing in the same direction.
Yeah.
I think you had a, yes.
I have sorry. I have a question to follow up on that, and it's like, you guys are talking about following your own passions, and like it seems like you never intended to be like famous or something, or like you weren't trying to gain fame. Like, do you wish you like do you ever wish you hadn't entered into the public eye or become famous? Is it like a blessing, or is it a curse, or is it something?
I mean,
John, you only became an Orthodox icon carver to get
because
famous.
I was right. I was like, if I can ride this to the top. Like, I think that for sure becoming somewhat famous has been a total surprise. Like nothing that I would never have expected. That the decision that I made in life, and I would say, to be honest, in my case, except for the time and the family part, which sometimes is a challenge, like because. I would say on the whole, it's actually been amazing because the things that I do and the things that I care about, I really care about them. And so for me, the possibility of having more of a reach in order to get that out there is like, wow, that is so cool, like so amazing. And then also, you know, living my little life in my very secluded way and carving in my workshop is great. But, you know, in that context, you know, I didn't get to meet Stephen or Greg or Jordan Peterson or all the people that I'm able to meet. And so for me, it's been amazing. Like, it's been like an adventure where I'm like, oh, you know, I'm talking to Russell Brand. Like, why am I talking to Russell Brand? It's the most ridiculous thing in the world. But it's like, there's been these moments where it's like,
With Russell mostly listening to Russell.
yeah, exactly.
Brand. Russell can talk. He gets these like reveries. He's amazing. He's so like incandescent. I feel a lot the same way. I mean, I had some luck younger. I mean, for me, one of the things that's weird is it's indistinguishable. I mean, my natural instincts after that is quite commercial. I write big thrillers. I write big screenplays. And so it's indistinguishable for me to have a successful career with me making more money and me having more fame. They're all kind of tied up in each other. I'd say the one thing that's been a blessing that I didn't think about was I didn't have a massively accelerated amount of fame when I was young.
Yes.
Because if it had hit me in those arrogant 20s, I'm sure I would have been insufferable. You know, there was a lot of getting knocked down along the way and a lot of like 6 books in and then the publishing, you know, a thing with my publisher and the numbers tank and I have to reinvent myself and get back up. And so as it's come slowly in different ways, I feel like it's given me a chance to acclimate kind of at each stage in a way where I hope that I'm wielding it with gratitude and responsibility. And as for the reach part, I love that. I mean, it's like, you know, so part of what I was talking about with following things that interest you, I sort of have 2 rules in my life in general. I never want to do anything that's not fun. Everything has to be fun or an adventure. And my time for things that aren't, I massively compress or delegate as much as I possibly can. Because it's not like you can do everything that's fun. And obviously this doesn't involve crises and suffering and family. But and the other thing is I try and spend as little time possible. And the more money I make, the more resources I have, and the more fame, such as it is, that I accrue. I don't want to spend any time doing anything that I want to spend as little time possible doing anything that anyone else can do who's not me. I want to spend all my time doing things that only I can do. And so that sort of influence, that sort of kind of reach that you get, the kind of power's a real word, weird word. I don't mean it that way, but let's just say solidity in being able to say, look, I'll do this thing, but I want to do it this way. It'll be more fun. And I want to do it with this person. And I'm on a book tour. And I think I want to be in conversation with a a good friend who's a big prominent New York Times selling writer instead of me getting up and doing a canned speech. And you get to move in the world in different ways. And then the people is the best part, especially when I've certainly dismissed the like, oh, I just want to be friends with people because they're famous. Like once you're over that, because famous people can be terrible and they can be great. It's just like billionaires.
Yeah.
They're some are
They're
incredibly
people.
brilliant, and you
They're just
understand
people.
why they've amassed so much. And some are like a giant pain in the ass who are egotistical. Everyone has all that, but if you can choose through your influence and through people's interest in you, good people and move through the world that way, it's incredible. Like you're talking about Stephen and me and James Orr and Douglas Headley and Douglas Murray and just the people that in the fellowship that we've had these are extraordinary people and humans, not just intellectually. And so it's been really positive. But again, if my first book had been on the New York Times bestseller list for 2 years and I sold a film deal, I probably would be a fairly profound asshole.
Mm-hmm.
I really like what you said about the fire. That seems essential to make anything meaningful. And I think that applies to the creative arts as well as being students or anything that you're really being yourself in. So this question has to do with
Is there anything that you're not
the act of
yourself?
creating as well as maybe being a student. And yeah, you have the fire and then you have what's the word?
What I mean by that is that even when you're fake in your own particular way. So there's kind of no escape from being ourselves. It's just the level of authenticity that we allow ourselves to operate within. But even our fake versions are showing much more than we give it credit.
Desperation, maybe. This feeling of everything will fall apart unless I do this thing.
Yes.
And that can come with deadlines, which is a very practical and helpful thing. For us, the weekly essay. For you, maybe it's what the publisher has given you. So just how do you keep the fire going and not fall into a sense of desperation?
Well, a metaphor for this in writing, I always encourage people when they get stuck, right? I don't get writer's block. And part of that is I'll just go. And I always encourage people to just write a vomit draft. Like
Yes.
just get something down.
Yes.
Because you can't fix a blank page.
Yes.
But if you have something, you can make it better. And
Absolutely.
I've been conditioning that sort of momentum for a really, really long time. And that fire and the desperation can be incredibly useful. Like the times where I've had to have a reinvention in my career and I feel like I'm writing for my life. And I'm in a mini version of it now, as Jonathan and I have been talking about. Like anytime there's a dislocation financially or creatively, you know, the unknown contains equal parts opportunity and threat. And the first thing
Yes.
you think about when you're younger, you think about threat. And it's important to keep orienting towards opportunity and to be aware of that. Get forward motion, get things down. One of the things I decided really early on, and it actually is an option for everybody, even though you're going to laugh at me probably, but I just decided to do everything way ahead of deadlines to never even have to think about them. And so I wrote my stuff way early in college. I'm a year and a half to 2 years ahead
Me
usually
too.
on the publishing schedule. I just want to be way out ahead, and if that's something you can figure out and you can do, but it opens up basically, you know, fun. I mean, I have a book coming out in 2 weeks. I'm going to go on a book tour that's a month and a half, and if I'm behind on delivering the next book, I can't come here, right, and have this weekend. And like weird shit comes up all the time. Like I helped write the opening to the last World Cup. It's such a weird thing, but like, you know, to get a call and go off to like Qatar for a week and then do all this research, like you need room to also be able to understand as things come in that you have the bandwidth to do it. And so a lot of ways it's like just make headway. You know, a lot of this is your own sort of stress and your own harsh driver. An important thing to do too one of the exercises I find really useful when you have the voices of desperation, which can be indistinguishable from voices of anxiety, or for some people depression, or for some people it's OCD when they're going, take them out of your head and just sit them on the couch next to you, and then you can really contemplate just how insane you are. And you can think, if you were a friend, if you're like, God, you're always late, like you're so useless, like if you can really try to remove that voice and think, is that someone I should be taking advice from? Is that advice I would give my own friend? And if you can separate out that voice and then you figure out what's an encouraging voice that you would take if you're talking to a friend of yours about getting on stuff earlier or hitting better goals. And it's probably one, and this is hard. This part is not like I figured this out in college. This is I still refigure it. But if you can find a voice in inner dialogue for yourself where you're finding the most adult part of yourself to lead the way, so those voices come up, but it's a younger voice in you, right? Maybe that's you being, like for me, I was the smallest kid when I started my high school with 1,200 boys, so I had a real scrappy, like have to get it, harsh, overbearing voice. And you can identify them, and then you pull them all in, you can invite all of that, and then you figure out what's your highest, best advice for you to excel and unfold and expand and shine. And so talking and working with that, like what's your voice? Is it being an encouraging coach? Is it being a older brother? Is it being a caring mentor? And if you can try and cultivate that in yourself, you'll have something to go to. And then more and more when you are in the throes of kind of desperation where you're losing your way, at least you'll know that it's temporary and that an adult's going to get there in the morning. Yeah.
No, here and then here.
Gonna go first? Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I had a question about how to navigate the political, because it seems that there's a story. There's always a story, but there's a collective story that it's missing in our institutions of education and our political institutions. And as we we're about to graduate and face the world, and I think like you want to remind people of the story of the West, but everything's just so politicized today that it's difficult to separate both. I guess there was some backlash when you both did the gospel series, and you're sitting at a table with Dennis Prague and Bishop Barron, and it's something in the wire, so of course Ben Shapiro, then his name comes up, and it starts to interfere with your image and how the world sees you, but you're just trying, at the end of the day, you're just trying to remind people of the story of Christ or the story of the West, and it's beautiful. So I'm just wondering if you have any
Exodus.
advice on
It's not
how to
Christ.
stick to the story and how to navigate the political.
If you don't, so one thing which is first is the backlash to the politics. A lot of it isn't real.
Yeah.
Like I didn't pay that much attention. I was so busy. I mean, those are a little further afield from my daily career. They're hugely important, but I'm not on like reading all these comments and everything else. And so we tend to pay a lot of attention to something as if we have to respond to something. And a lot of times it's like, you don't know who it is. You don't know if Twitter's freaking out. You don't know if that's foreign, a bot swarm, if it's foreign people, if it's anonymous people. It's just kind of not real in a way, unless it really comes to your doorstep. And at times it will. And when it does come to your doorstep, if you've insulated yourself from the constant Sturm und Drang nonsense that basically is fed by, I think, foreign psyops, bad faith players, or psychopathic algorithms,
Yeah.
if you're aware of that and not becoming of them and engaging with them, when it comes to your door in a way that's real, you have more bearing to engage with it in a way that's transformational and not getting down in the gutter with it and getting screamy about it. And handling it with a bit more grace. I mean, the other thing is I always come back to, there was a big period in writing, which I think we're thawing out of, but not entirely, of having sensitivity readers. And that to me is like completely insane, right? To have, some 22-year-old graduate of Haverford like reading my shit to see what might be offensive through a framework. It's just bonkers. And so, but part of how I handled that wasn't like, getting up on a soapbox and screaming. I told my editor, I was like, I don't want it, and I don't care about this at all. If this is something they just been involved in a very big case that legal and other stuff. I said, if you need this to cover your ass on your legal side, that's fine. I'll read it. And if there's anything useful in there, as with anything, I'll integrate it. And it turns out one thing was, like, I used a Spanish phrase slightly wrong. I have a lot of characters who were Mexican in my books and in this book in particular. But the other thing that I did, and you could see where you could get very reactionary, but for this book in particular, what was so funny was one of my close friends is a novelist and nonfiction writer named Luis Oria. And I think he's our greatest Mexican-American living writer. He's incredible. He's shortlisted. I think he won the Pulitzer for Devil's Highway. I mean, he's just a no shit knockdown writing genius. And so what I had done with this manuscript, a lot of it takes place in Mexico, was I'd given it to him to be like, is my slang right? Is this, like, I have a lot of colorful cursing. And so he'd sort of gone through the book with me and was like, oh, this is a great phrase and you should do this and here's the food they'd be serving. And like I did all that the way I do research for my guns and ammunition, right? So as a novelist, there's two things you can't do that'll end your career. If you get a gun detail wrong, you're just finished. And if you kill a cat, like the cat people just come for you and they'll put you in an early grave. But but I do a ton of research, right? I have a hacking expert if I'm writing about hacking. I have guns, I have ammo, I have demolition breaching. And I treated this with a great deal of respect because there was a lot of stuff that was there. I mean, I'm in California, I'm very close with, I have family, friends, community, all of this, but I wanted to get that right. And what was funny was because I didn't have a big political statement around it, I was sort of like, sure, you can have this kid. By the way, like, arguably our greatest Mexican-American living writer has already been my subject matter expert on this. And so it was just such a sidestep from a position of solidity that it didn't turn into the political because I was doing the things that were based on the ethic of my field. And that is making sure that my writing is of the highest standard and then checking with subject matter experts so that I can have enough verisimilitude to carry the reader across the suspension of disbelief. And so a lot of ways you can avoid it if you're not reacting into it too. And you can stay the hell out of it as much as you can.
And like I think also in terms of politics, like I don't touch politics a lot in the stuff that I do, but I think that it's actually totally fine to be concerned by the political, to be involved in the political. The problem is the partisan politics, because partisan politics is just basically team blue, team red. Like it's just my team. There's no substance to it, and I think the thing that has been interesting, and in this space, there is a kind of space where hopefully there are people that are able to talk about politics, still have a side. It's okay to have a side in a conflict, but also be willing to understand what the argument is, what it actually is, and to represent it honestly and to be able to listen to the opposition, because the best thing you can have is a good opposition, because it's actually reflecting back to you. And so, I think that at least in my case, for example, like the connection with the Daily Wire is I'm just going to come to the Daily Wire and say the things that I always say. And I'm not going to change I'm not going to now all of a sudden start talking about the things that I don't usually care about or talk about, and I'm not going to let them, let's say, overpower what I care about and what I think is important. And, and I'll walk along with people as long as I can, and then when I can't walk with them, I'll just make sure that that you can see that I don't agree with them after that, and to me that's enough. And people will rail and people will complain, but usually those voices are actually not that, like Greg was saying, they're not that real. Like, there's people that scream really loud, but they actually, if you engage with them, then
they're real.
Then you just start to spiral. But if you just let it, you just ignore it, and you just keep doing what you're doing.
Look, I've had this like pretty early days. I mean, my communities are exceedingly liberal, and many of them captured. I live in LA, right? I was born in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm a novelist. I did a ton of visible work for the Democrats, trying to pull them back and wrestle them back from the idiotic left. Like I'm very, I'm a screenwriter. Like if I was any more on brand, I'd be like a Tesla. It's like a very from that world, but so many of my relationships aren't, and I've never stood down for them for a minute, including with Jordan early days when all that went bad. But I also didn't move over and pick up a bullhorn from the other side and start screaming. I was always sort of building bridges. But like me going on Daily Wire was huge. Like I didn't know if that could have had massive ramifications for my career in publishing in Hollywood and elsewhere. I had somebody suggest to me that going to a premiere for a Daily Wire event could terminate the morality clause of a contract I had with a major studio.
Wow.
Like, that's the level of insanity. And I've just never treated it like it's, I said, you know, I was like, that's utterly insane. Do you hear what you're saying?
Yeah.
It's like the CCP. And I just have not engaged with it in some ways. And I've stood by my friends when they're my friends, and I've showed up. And a lot of times, if you engage and start the fight and start the resentment and start, you don't understand, you need to, that's the thing that makes it real and tangible. And look, it might come in a way that you can't do anything about it. And that's happened to me a few times. And then what you have is the grace and poise that you have from not having given into it and decided to live in it. Because it doesn't matter if it's not real. The people who get killed are those people who issue those awful hostage statements. Like, there was a prominent actor who mentioned that Ben Shapiro's like an okay guy, maybe, and then there was a story. It was like, I'm sorry, I'll re-examine my privilege and I'll do the work. And at that point, it's like, look, man. I mean, I learned from Frederick Douglass and Mark Twain. You never apologize to a mob, ever, especially a faceless mob based on, you know, deep machine learning and AI patterns on social media. So if you don't do the thing that's revealing yourself, then you're screwed, because then forever everybody knows who you are and where you're located. Careful with apologizing. You know, apologize for sure and cleanly when you're wrong, but, you know, don't ever apologize out of fear of repercussions.
We have time for one more question. To the end, and I heard.
We got 3 more. Why don't we run them real fast? Okay.
Okay. I have a somewhat back to the basics sort of question, and this is something that I personally have struggled with. I think a lot of liberal arts students struggle with this, not all, but I think one of the problems that we have coming with such a very general background and an interest in like so many things, it's very hard to pin down what you want to do. Like the one thing that you are like very interested in, or like even the several things that
You
like,
would
you're very
know it
interested
if it
in and then
exists.
could commit to like long term. Because I think to like develop like this sort of this art, you kind of have to commit, you know. And so how do we go about like figuring out that one thing or those several things that are most interesting to us?
They pick you.
It's hard for me to answer that because I don't have that problem. So it's like in some ways, I follow threads. This is actually how I live. So like, let's take the icon carving aspect to my life. You know, I started carving icons in 2002, but I only started doing it really seriously in around 2010. So you have a huge gap in between. But the way that I function is that there are threads that I see, and these threads are like they're like the trap door that's opening, like the opportunity that's presenting itself. And then when I see that, I just go and I move in that direction, and I hold on to the other things. Like I kind of hold on to them. I never forgot that I would love to carve icons. Like it was just part of my life for what is it, like almost, you know, like eight years or whatever, or 7 years. And then when all of a sudden the door was open, I was ready, and I just grabbed the thread and I just started moving in that direction. And so it also depends on your opportunities. Like sometimes you just, if you do whatever it is, if you have things in front of you that are kind of glowing, even if it's not like the thing that you want to do, and you do it the best with all your energy and all your love, and it has that flow to it, you'll find your way. You know, it'll lead you, and once you find the thing that you're doing, you know, you might have thought, wow, 10 years ago I never would have thought that this is where I would be, and that's also completely fine.
I think we all, early on coming out of school, worry about this. And one of the biggest things is you're thinking too far in the future and you're thinking too globally. And a lot of things is the amount of things that will change. Like even if you're successful beyond your wildest dreams, it won't be aligned with what your wildest dreams are now. It's not going to look like anything that you want, even if it goes well, because there's so much change. And all you have to worry about is if you have your framing right with your value system, right, in a bigger way, what is the most interesting thing for you to do right now? That's all that matters. Tomorrow, this week, what's your next paper? What's your next assignment that you're going to all write ahead of deadline? Because if you think out ahead, it's like you're just borrowing tomorrow's trouble. By the time you get anywhere close to that, you're going to have way more information and way more failures and dead ends and opportunities and corrections. There's going to be so much new, more data. But of course, you can't help to be worried about it because you're human.
Yes.
But try and concretize it here. What do you want to do right now? What's a paper you could write? What's a book you're going to read? What's a art that you're going to engage in that will consume you, right? And then even if it doesn't and it's a failure, you get in, you're not interested, that's still progress because you're carving off an option that's moving into something else.
Thank you both for coming here today. I had a question about the creative process. When you start with either an image or a symbol or this kind of picture in your mind, do you know that it's going to be something much larger immediately? Does it sort of marinate until it comes to fruition? How does that
I
go
don't.
from this interesting snippet to a larger project? And do you know that it's going to succeed, or if it might just kind of languish on its own?
Of course not.
Those are you. I used to have a quicker cycle of like idea to go. Like one of the benefits that I had was I didn't have a break between, like I remember the first time I wanted to write a play, I'm like, let me just start writing a play. And I remember the first job I got in TV, which wasn't really a job, I was translating and counting animated mouth flaps for Dragon Ball Z and matching English words into a badly translated Japanese script that was largely perverse. So we had to get it around the censors, right? Because there'd be like an old guy grabbing a girl's ass and I have to be like, oh, let me brush that twig off your dress. So it was like, but the first job I had, I was literally like on the plane with the producer flying to the studio in Fort Worth, reading a book about how to format screenplays, right? So that the movement was so fast, I just was like, let me go and try it. And when you're talking about which ideas take, I think part of it was I used to move quicker into it. Like I'd have an idea, it'd be a book, I'd put all my energy in and go. And as I get older, it's very interesting. I've just been observing this in a very significant way lately. I have some ideas where I think, oh my God, that's the next book. And I'll flesh out 4 or 5 pages of notes and I'll sit on it and give it more time. And it's almost like stagnant. I never used to do this. I used to, anything that I was aimed at next, I would just do. And I'm giving a lot more time for breathing. And I just got into a situation with the manuscript I'm working on now. This will be my 26th or 27th, where I wrote into it 30% and then recognized that the entire ending and direction I was going to go isn't what I want. And I haven't had that since like one of my first books. And so there's a weird freedom again that's happening now where I'm slowing in the creative process to take a lot more time to try and like measure twice and cut once. That has been a natural process. And I think that part of it is when you first get an idea, if it grabs you, you go with it, right? It's like being carried by away in an undertow almost. But also if you write things down, you can see if they continue to live and yield, right? A lot of times when I think of a story, it's like when you first lay down on a towel on the beach and it's all uncomfortable and lumpy and you kind of have to adjust yourself into it. There's a form that the story needs to take. And if you can think about it when you have some notes, you can see if your mind's continuing to masticate on the idea and settle it in more and more. And that's really what we're doing, to write down a bunch of notes and see, are you compelled to return to it and to adjust it and to get into it further, and is it living and breathing? And this other thing might be 4 or 5 pages of bullet points that you're like, there's no there.
Yeah, thank you both. I was wondering if you could speak to this idea that an artist should maybe create what they're interested in as opposed to catering to an audience, if you think that's accurate, or if you should cater somewhat to an audience. And then if you think that like the retelling of old stories, insofar as that pertains to the previous question, is something that should be considered.
Yeah, I definitely, I have a different perspective on art in general, which is that I really do think that art should be useful. That's why, one of the reasons why I became an icon carver was because
it can
there was
help it.
something missing in the idea of understanding art as a performer in a public that was in some ways alienating, because there's a sense in which you're you're creating something that doesn't actually participate in the life of the person. It's like a diversion or distraction, entertainment, right? That image. There's nothing wrong with entertainment. It's fine. But there was something about how I wanted the line, the connection to be far deeper. And realizing that in fact I wanted more an art that was like making a chair for someone. Where it's like, well, you make a chair so that people can sit in it and it participates in their life. And that's how I entered into icon carving, was because I wanted the line to be set. I wanted to make an object that someone will take and will be their patron saint, that they were given to when they're baptized, or like a cross that a priest wears, and that it's just part of their life, and it doesn't have that structure of the artist and the public that is actually very modern. Like it's it's in some ways it's quite a recent idea. Like in fictional stories in the past or in the Middle Ages, you know, they would still be participative in the sense that you'd have a troubadour that would come and would like tell the story and it would engage people into it. There was this whole participative sense. Even our idea of the public, right?
That's exactly how death of art and death of God are related. At the beginning, God was super concrete and art was the integral part of it. This idol was a piece of art who was worshipped as a god, and then the idea of God got progressively abstracted, and so did the idea of art. And then they both got abstracted away into nothingness, to the point that they were too much of everything, so they became nothing. So then the God was dead and the art was dead. And probably there's a particular golden mean between the super abstraction and super concreteness than the idea of having a faith into some kind of God-like idea would make sense in that middle point. So does the art part. The art part, the art that is grounded into the craft of it, does not dismiss it, carry its message by the mean of its craft to be able to communicate it.
We don't have, like, even in Shakespeare's days, where we don't have the idea that the public can like kick the people off stage, that we can yell them down, that we can like make them stop because they suck. Like we don't have that. I know, like where there's like the polite public.
Don't give them any ideas.
It's like this pure like alienated, you know, passive public, right? And I'm saying, like, I want to be careful. I'm not saying that is wrong or whatever. I'm just saying that's not what I wanted. So as I come towards storytelling, I have the same approach, which is I want to tell stories that will enter into people's lives and will become part of their life. And that's why my first tendency is to say, can I grab things in memory that are anchors for identity? And now can I represent them in a way that is fresh and alive and that people can re-enter into them? So even when I think about the entertainment part of it, which is like, you know, let's say I'm writing a graphic novel series. Like the graphic novel series is, for me, is something like, yes, it's going to be entertaining and fun for your 17-year-old, you know, guy that's looking for a kind of adventure story. But everything about it is trying to re-anchor you back into memory. And
That's
become
probably how we save
a
art.
track for thinking and for identification. So that's been my approach to storytelling, and I don't think it's the only one, but at least at this moment in my life, it's the only thing that makes me care about storytelling. And so, like, that's why Greg and I, like, if we're going to do something together, for me it was like, well, let's do Genesis, because it's like, if we could pull that off, like if we could create a narratively compelling retelling of creation and the fall and Cain and Abel. I mean, can you imagine this? In some ways, the service we would be rendering Western civilization. Like it sounds like it's cocky, but really, like I believe that it's like that's what Milton was able to do.
Yes.
Right? Milton was able to do that, and there are very few people that have been able to do it. So I'm like, man, if we could pull that off, that'd be an amazing thing. And so, and I don't only see it as, oh, we'll keep people happy, we'll divert them, we'll like it to be entertainment. No, I think it's like, it's really going to the core.
I can answer this from the more, I think I'm more consistently in touch with the commercial side of things. And what's interesting is my advice holds, but for slightly different reasons. There's a lot of people who say, like right after the Da Vinci Code came out with Dan Brown, right? There's this glut of everybody writing symbology texts, right? Or, you know, secret society stuff. By the time you write that, right, that's a year and a half, 2 years. Then a book needs a year lead time on publication. You don't even know where you are. And one of the things is I sat next to a woman on the flight out here who's a pretty renowned comedian, but she's just switching over and doing some writing a pilot. And she was talking about like, well, how do you do it and what do you want? And you always hear this in Hollywood, right? Everyone's buying for which, you know, somebody thought that what we really need is a rap opera about Hamilton, and that's going to take over the world. Nobody thought that like a magic school for like, you know, little kids. I mean, Scholastic bought that book for like nothing. It was like educationally, right? They're not a big commercial house. There's a judge who famously remarked about pornography, like, you know, what's the definition of pornography? I don't know, but I know when I see it. And there was this notion that like you're going into this collective being, like publishing or Hollywood, that anybody knows anything. There's a very famous line by William Goldman, who's the preeminent screenwriter of Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid at Marathon Man. He says, nobody knows anything. That's the lesson about Hollywood. And so to try to anticipate market or to guess or to say, oh, what's selling right now are quirky medical shows like House, that might not be aligned with your inner pattern, which means you might not be able to do that brilliantly. And the one thing you're going to have as an artist, or as anything that you are, as an engineer, as a vet, as a doctor, as a diagnostician, pick your field, is that when it's aligned with you, when it resonates with you, you have something to say or to give that only you can say or give. And that's profoundly true if you're an artist. And if you're trying to go apply it to, you know, some formula of what's going to sell 2 years from now when
Not
something gets
even
made,
possible.
you just can't even anticipate it. And all the successes that come between now and then are going to be surprising from things that are made that are undeniable. And so I would say, my own aesthetic happens to be fairly commercial. But when I'm writing to write the best possible version of it. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit tomorrow about, you know, what does it mean to be commercial versus literary? But the best version, and what that doesn't mean is that you can be arcane and you can be cute and you can be inside and you can be snide and you can be intellectual and you can make a work that's impenetrable, right? What you want is to write something that's accessible, but the best version of writing is where it's accessible to everyone, high or low, and you're not playing games to show how smart you are. Like, I never want me as the novelist to be what people are thinking of when they're reading a story. I want them to be thinking about the story. And so in that way, I'm making sure that
That's the thing about a masterpiece. A masterpiece resonates at all levels. If I look at a Rubens painting, if I have a knowledge of the story that he tells, I get more out of it. If I don't know anything about anything, I just marvel at his technique. So at whatever level of depth you go with into a masterpiece, you get more out of it, and is accessible at all levels. Because it's a masterpiece. It integrated all the levels at the same time.
Guiding and in conversation with readers in a way that brings them along. But they don't know we don't know what we want. None of us know what we want, right? So to take it from readers who say, I'd really love if Orphan X, you know, went to the moon. It's like, no, you don't. You have no idea what you want, right? Like, you like it and you're engaged with it because I'm showing you something that you didn't think of yourself. So you don't want to cede to that.
Well, this has been really a wonderful conversation. Thank you for sharing your friendship and your passion and your story with us. In closing, I just want to say how honored we are at Ralston College to have both of you here, not only as guests, as speakers, but really sincerely as friends. You both have given so much to this little fledgling institution. And I think, speaking as an actress, a writer, myself, a story maker, someone who's so desperately clung to this idea that stories matter, the story of Ralston College comes at a time that I think the world is ready to hear it. And I'm curious, from your perspectives, if you could leave with us as a final thought. What does this place, this endeavor, what does Ralston mean to you, and what do you think it has to give to the world?
Yeah, I think there really is a confluence of moments and things happening in the world in general, and I think Ralston is stepping into that exactly at the right time. I think right now is the right time, and the thing is that because it's something like what Greg said, the idea is that the luminary is invisible to most people. The thing that is actually going to be the seed that will bear fruit in the future, there are only, it's like it appears as this small light, and you need a certain kind of perception and a kind of intuition to see that that's the thing that is going to. And when I come here and when I heard about the way that Ralston's doing things, whether it's the culture that they're setting up with you, whether it's the pedagogy, whether it is the way in which they're structuring what you're learning and in what order and how they're doing it by bringing you to Greece and to do that, I personally immediately perceive that this is a life-giving thing, that it is something which will bear fruit in the future. And my vision is that, Ralston now is this little thing with like 20-something students, but that this way of thinking and of doing will yield. And so because of that, and because I can see, and it's partly one of the things that makes me see that is also the quality of people that are drawn to it, right? So you notice, you watch, it just happens naturally. You're just like, oh, look at this person who is interested. Look at this person who is kind of like that and like curious and coming and moving towards it, whether it's the people that are working for Ralston, whether it's the people that are kind of becoming this kind of network of friends. You're like, oh, yes, I can see that this is in some ways almost like a vision of the future. It's a vision of a movement or a new beginning of something that's growing. And so because of that, I really believe that Ralston is a treasure, and that and the fruits are not apparent right now. They can't be, because it is a new beginning. It's like a seed. But I trust and I can see that through all of these, with all of this happening, even in terms of what's happening in the world, in terms of politics, in terms of in the fragmentation, but this like desire to create a new beginning, I see only a bright future. That's my perception. Yeah.
There's a conference we were at last year in London, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali was speaking, and she talked about Western civilization as a beautiful cut flower that's like resting on a table. And she said, our job now is to plant seeds, right? We're severed from our roots in a certain way. And Ralston, there's a reason you've used that metaphor multiple times. Ralston is a seed that way. And part of how I know when I'm in the right place or affiliated with the right place is a large part it's how I feel when I'm here. There's an aliveness that is here. There's an aliveness of learning. There's nothing that feels sort of stuffed shirt or rigid or workmanlike. And to me, it's a callback. I went to fancy colleges back when they were still places to be proud of. And so I really had this. I could find a track when I was there with incredible professors, incredible classmates, and it's so absent. And when I'm here and the people around here, and I came with my wife, who's a psychologist and a psychology professor. We came last year or 2 years ago, I can't quite remember. It was very similar for her. There's students she's still in touch with, of just there's a respect, there's a hunger, there's an aliveness in the students here. There's an earnestness, and that's in rare supply, right? When Snark and Snide is ascendant, to be earnestly engaged, but with a sense of humor. And there's naughtiness, and there's boxing, and there's you know, there's all the things that are going to be necessary for any institution to keep it revivified. But this is an incredibly special place, and so that's part of why I'm always delighted to come back. I'm always delighted to be near it because I feel like one of the best things is when asked to go somewhere to contribute or be of help, you feel like it's nourishing, that the whole process is nourishing also. And that's how I feel when I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're saying the humanist, tradition, classicist, and a tradition-based approach to new civic architecture, federal architecture, which was a project that began in the previous Republican administration and
What the
bubbled
fuck
up
is
into
that?
an executive order that
Okay.
I finally figured out how to have
Yes.
Visit past episodes for the most potent and actionable science-based tools for mental health, physical health, and performance. And now, my conversation with Dr. Carl Deiseroff.
Well, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. So for people that might not be so familiar with the fields of neuroscience, etc., what is the difference between neurology and psychiatry?
Psychiatry focuses on disorders where we can't see something that's physically wrong, where we don't have a measurable, where there's no blood test that makes the diagnosis, there's no brain scan that tells us this is schizophrenia, this is depression for an individual patient. And so psychiatry is much more mysterious, and the only tools we have are words. Neurologists are fantastic physicians. They see the stroke on brain scans, they see the seizure and the pre-seizure activity with an EEG, and they can measure and treat based on those measurables. In psychiatry, we have a harder job. We use words. We have rating scales for symptoms. We can measure depression and autism with rating scales, but those are words still. And ultimately, that's what psychiatry is built around. It's an odd situation because we've got the most complex, beautiful, mysterious, incredibly engineered object in the universe, and yet all we have are words to find our way in.
So do you find that if a patient is very verbal or hyperverbal, that you have an easier time diagnosing them as opposed to somebody who's more quiet and reserved? Or I can imagine the opposite might be true as well.
Well,
Good
because we
question.
only have words, you've put your finger on a key point. If they don't speak that much, in principle, it's harder. The lack of speech can be a symptom. We can see that in depression. We can see that in the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. We can see that in autism. Sometimes by itself, that is a symptom, reduced speech. But ultimately, you do need something. You need some words to help guide you. And that, in fact, there's challenges that I can tell you about where patients with depression who are so depressed they can't speak, that makes it a bit of a challenge to distinguish depression from some of the other reasons they might not be speaking. And this is a sort of the art and the science of psychiatry.
Do you think we will ever have a blood test for depression or schizophrenia or autism? And would that be a good or a bad thing?
I think ultimately there will be quantitative tests. Already efforts are being made to look at certain rhythms in the brain using external EEGs to look at brain waves effectively. But ultimately what's going on in the brain in psychiatric disease is physical, and it's due to the circuits and the connections and the projections in the brain that are not working as they would in a typical situation. And I do think we'll have those measurables at some point. Could it be abused or misused? Certainly, but that's, I think, true for all of medicine.
I want to know, and I'm sure there are several, but what do you see as the biggest challenge facing psychiatry and the treatment of mental illness today?
I think we have, we're making progress on what the biggest challenge is, which I think there's still such a strong stigma for psychiatric disease that patients often don't come to us, and they feel that they should be able to handle this on their own. And that can slow treatment. It can lead to worsening symptoms. We know, for example, patients who have untreated anxiety issues, if you go for a year or more with a serious untreated anxiety issue, that can convert to depression. You can add another problem on top of the anxiety. And so it would be, why do people not come for treatment? They feel like this is something they should be able to master on their own, which can be true, but usually some help is a good thing.
That raises a question related to something I heard you say many years ago at a lecture, which was that this was a scientific lecture, and you said, we don't know how other people feel. Most of the time, we don't even really know how we feel.
Yes.
Maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit, and the dearth of ways that we have to talk about feelings. I mean, there's so many words. I don't know how many, but I'm guessing there are more than a dozen words to describe the state that I call sadness. But as far as I understand, we don't have any way of comparing that in a real objective sense. So how, as a psychiatrist, when your job is to use words to diagnose, words of the patient to diagnose, do you maneuver around that? And what is this landscape that we call feelings or emotions?
This is really interesting. People, here we have there's a tension between the words that we've built up in the clinic that mean something to the physicians, and then there's the colloquial use of words that may not be the same. And so that's the first level we have to sort out. When someone says, I'm depressed, what exactly do they mean by that? That may be different from what we're talking about in terms of depression. So part of psychiatry is to get beyond that word and to get into how they're actually feeling, get rid of the jargon and get to real world examples of how they're feeling. So, how much do you look forward into the future? How much hope do you have? How much planning are you doing for the future? So here now you're getting into actual things you can talk about that are unambiguous. If someone says, I can't even think about tomorrow. I'm not, I don't see how I'm going to get to tomorrow. That's a nice, precise thing that, it's sad, it's tragic, but it's also, that means something, and we know what that means. That's the hopelessness symptom of depression. And that is what I try to do when I do a psychiatric interview. I try to get past the jargon and get to what's actually happening in the patient's life and in their mind. But as you say, ultimately, this shows up across, I address this issue every day in my life, whether it's in the lab, where we're looking at animals, whether fish or mice or rats, and studying their behavior, or when I'm in a conversation with just a friend or a colleague, or when I'm talking to a patient. I never really know what's going on inside the mind of the other person. I get some feedback, I get words, I get behaviors, I get actions, but I never really know.
Are there any very good treatments for psychiatric disease? Meaning, are there currently any pills, potions, forms of communication that reliably work every time or work in most patients? And could you give a couple examples of great successes of psychiatry if they exist?
Yes. And psychiatry, despite the depths of the mystery we struggle with, many of our treatments are actually, we may be doing better than some other specialties in terms of actually causing, therapeutic benefit for patients.
Okay.
We do help patients, patients who suffer from, by the way, both medications and talk therapy have been shown to be extremely effective in many cases. For example, people with panic disorder, cognitive behavioral therapy, just working with words, helping people identify the early signs of when they're starting to move toward a panic
panics
attack,
and phobias
or
are
cognitions that are
great
happening. You can train people
for
to
treatment.
derail that, and you can very potently treat panic disorder that way.
Yeah.
There are many psychiatric medications that are very effective for the conditions that they're treating. Antipsychotic medications, they have side effects, but boy, do they work. They really can clear up auditory hallucinations, the paranoia. And then, this is a frustrating and yet heartening aspect of psychiatry. There are treatments like electroconvulsive therapy, which is where it's extremely effective for depression. We have patients who nothing else works for them, where they can't tolerate medications, and you can administer under a very safe, controlled condition where the patient's body is not moving. They're put into a very safe situation where the body doesn't move or seize. It's just an internal process that's triggered in the brain. This is an extraordinarily effective treatment for treatment-resistant depression. At the same time, I find it as heartening as it is to see patients respond to this with who have severe depression. I'm also frustrated by it. Why can't we do something more precise than this for these very severe cases? In all of these cases, though, in psychiatry, the frustrating thing is that we don't have the level of understanding that a cardiologist has in thinking about the heart. The heart is, we now know, it's a pump. It's pumping blood, and so you can look at everything about how it's working or not working in terms of that frame. It's clearly a pump. We don't really have that level of what is the circuit really there for in psychiatry.
What are the pieces that are going to be required to cure autism, cure Parkinson's, cure schizophrenia? I would imagine there are several elements and bins here.
Okay.
Understanding the natural biology, understanding what the activity patterns are, how to modify those. Maybe you could just tell us what you think. What is the bento box of the perfect cure?
Yeah. I think the first thing we need is understanding. What is the element of the brain that's analogous to the pumping heart? When we think about the symptoms of depression, that's maybe, we think about motivation and dopamine neurons. And so then that turns our attention as neuroscientists. We think, okay, let's think about the parts of the brain that are involved in dealing with merging complex data streams that are very high in bit rate that need to be fused together into a unitary concept. And that starts to guide us, and maybe we can, and we know other animals are social in their own way, we can study those animals. And so that's how I think about it. There's hope for the future, thinking about the symptoms as an engineer might, and trying to identify the circuits that are likely working to make this typical behavior happen, and that will help us understand how it becomes atypical.
We need to know the circuits, we need to know the cells in the various brain regions and portions of them.
By the way, a painting advice. Sometimes when you're focused on one area, the solution lies within the surrounding area. So if you solve the surrounding shapes first, you might get a better idea about the things that you're working on previously. Second, it might even be resolved as a result of solving the surrounding shapes. So
the body and how they connect to one another, and what the patterns of activity are under a normal, quote unquote, healthy interaction.
Yeah.
If we understand that, then it seems that the next step, which of course could be carried out in parallel, right? That work can be done alongside work where various elements within those circuits are tweaked just right. Like the tuning of a piano in the subtle way, or maybe even like the replacement of a whole set of keys if the piano is lacking keys, so to speak. In 2015, there was this, what I thought was a very nice article published in the New Yorker describing your work and the current state of your work in the laboratory, in the clinic, and an interaction with a patient. So this, as I recall, a woman who was severely depressed, and you reported in that article some of the discussion with this patient, and then in real time increase the activation of the so-called vagus nerve, this 10th cranial nerve that extends to the skull and innervates many of the viscera and the body. What is the potential for channel rhodopsins or related types of algae engineering to be used to manipulate the vagus? Because I believe in that instance it wasn't channel rhodopsin stimulation, it was electrical stimulation, right? Or to manipulate, for instance, a very small localized region of the brain. Let me frame it a little bit differently in light of what we were talking about a couple minutes ago. My understanding is that if somebody has severe depression and they take any number of the available pharmaceutical agents that are out there, SSRI, serotonergic agents, increase dopamine, increase whatever, that sometimes they experience relief, but there are often serious side effects. Sometimes they don't experience relief, but as I understand it, channel opsins and their related technology, in principle, would allow you to turn on or off the specific regions of the brain that lead to the depressive symptoms, or maybe you turn up a happiness circuit or a positive anticipation circuit. Where are we at now in terms of bringing this technology to the nervous system? And let's start with the body and then move into the skull.
Yeah. So starting with the body is a good example because it highlights the opportunity and how far we have to go. So let's take this example of vagus nerve stimulation. So the vagus nerve, it's the 10th cranial nerve. It comes from the brain, it goes down, it innervates the heart, innervates the gut. By innervate, I mean it sends little connections down to help guide what happens in these organs in the abdomen and chest. It also collects information back, and there's information coming back from all those organs that also go through this vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve, back to the brain. And so this is somewhat of a superhighway to the brain. Then was the idea, and maybe the idea is maybe we could put a little cuff, a little electrical device around the vagus nerve itself, so a way of getting into the brain without putting something physical into the brain.
And why the vagus? I mean, it's there, and it's accessible.
That's the reason.
That's the reason.
That's the reason, yes.
Really?
Yeah.
You're not kidding.
I'm not kidding.
So stimulating the vagus to treat depression simply because it's accessible.
It started as an epilepsy treatment, and it can help with epilepsy, but the vagus nerve lands on a particular spot in the brain called the solitary tract nucleus, which is just one synapse away from the serotonin and the dopamine and the norepinephrine.
So there's a link to chemical systems in the brain that make it a rational choice.
Yes, it's not irrational, but I can tell you that even if that were not true, the same thing would have been tried.
That's what it done it anyway.
Because it's accessible. Yeah.
I see. How do you think it's working when it does work? Is it triggering the activation of
Work
neurons that release more serotonin or dopamine?
It could be, but I would say we don't have evidence for that, and so I just don't know. But what is clear is that it's dose limited in how high and strongly we can stimulate. And why? It's because it's an electrode and it's stimulating everything nearby. And when you turn on the vagus nerve stimulator, patient's voice becomes strangulated and hoarse. They can have trouble swallowing. They can have trouble speaking for sure, even some trouble breathing. Because everything in the neck, every electrically responsive cell and projection in the neck is being affected by this electrode. And so you can go up just so far with the intensity, and then you have to stop. So, to your initial question, could a more precise stimulation method like optogenetics help in this setting? In principle, it could, because that would, if you would target the light sensitivity to just the right kind of cell, let's say cell X that goes from point A to point B that causes symptom relief of a particular kind, then you're in business. You can have that be the only cell that's light sensitive. You're not going to affect any of the other cells, the larynx and the pharynx and the projections passing through. So that's the hope, that's the opportunity. The problem is that we don't yet have that level of specific knowledge. We don't know, okay, it's the cell starting in point A going to point B that relieves this particular symptom.
We want to fix this key on the piano.
Okay.
I'm imagining a little tiny blue light emitting object that's a little bigger than a clump of cells, or maybe about the size of a clump of cells. So we're talking about a little tiny stamp at each edge, 0.5 millimeter in size. I could imagine that being put under my skin, and then I would hit an app on my phone, and I'd say, Dr. Diceroth, I'm not feeling great today. Can I increase the stimulation? And you say, go for it. And then I ramp it up. Is that how it would go?
I mean, that's effectively what we already do with the vagus nerve stimulation. The doctor in this case, and I have this in some of my patients in the clinic, I do vagus nerve stimulation. I talk to them, I say how I go through the symptoms. I use the psychiatric interview to elicit their internal states. And then I have a radio frequency controller that I can dial in.
Right there in real time.
Right there in real
You're
time.
holding the remote control essentially to their brain, although it's remote control.
Through a couple steps. Yeah. And I can turn up the frequency, I can turn up the intensity, all with the radio frequency and control, and then it's reprogrammed or redosed, and then the patient can then leave at this altered dose. In most patients, I don't expect an immediate mood change. What I do is I increase the dose until a next level up while asking the patient for side effects. Can you still breathe okay? Can you still swallow okay? And I can hear their voice as well, and I can get a sense.
And you're looking at their face.
Yeah, I'm looking at their face. And so I can get a sense, is there am I still in a safe side effect regime? And then, you know, I stop at a particular point that looks safe, and then the patient goes home, comes back a month later, and I get the report on how things were over that month.
That's very exciting. What are your thoughts about brain-machine interface? Is something that's been happening for a long time now. Devices, little probes that are going to stimulate different patterns of activity in ensembles of neurons.
First of all, it's an amazing scientific discovery approach. As you mentioned, we and others here at Stanford are using electrodes, collecting information from tens of thousands of neurons, even separate from the Neuralink work. As you point out, many people have been doing this in humans as well as in non-human primates. And this is pretty powerful. It's important. This will let us understand what's going on in the brain in psychiatric disease and neurological disease, and will give us ideas for treatment. I see that as something that will be part of psychiatry in the long run. Already with deep brain stimulation approaches, we can help people with psychiatric disorders, and that's putting just a single electrode, not even a complex, closed loop system where you're both playing in and getting information back. Even just a single stimulation electrode in the brain can help people with OCD, for example, quite powerfully.
One of the questions I get asked a lot is about ADHD and attention deficit of various kinds. I have the hunch that one reason I get asked so often is that people are feeling really distracted and challenged in funneling their attention and their behavior. But and there are a number of reasons for that, of course. But what is true ADHD, and what does it look like? What can be done for it? And what, if any, role for channelopsins or these downstream technologies that you're developing? What do they offer for people that suffer from ADHD or have a family member that suffers from ADHD?
Yeah. This is it's a pretty interesting branch of psychiatry. There's no question that people have been helped by the treatments. There's active debate over what fraction of people who have these symptoms can or should be treated.
This is typically Adderall or stimulants of some kind.
For example, stimulants. That's right. So ADHD, it's as its name suggests, it has symptoms of. It can have either a hyperactive state or an inattentive state, and those can be completely separate from each other. You could have a patient who effectively is not hyperactive at all, but can't remain focused on the what's going on around them.
So their body can be still, but their mind is darting around.
That's right.
Or they can be very hyperactive with their body.
Yeah, it happens both
Probably
ways.
rarely is somebody hyperactive with their body, but their mind is still.
I notice I have to think complex, abstract thoughts. I notice I have to be very still. So my body has to be almost completely unmoving for me to think very abstractly and deeply. Other people are different. Some people, when they're running, they get their best thoughts. I can't even imagine that. My brain does not work that way at all. I have to be totally motionless, which is kind of interesting.
How do you go about that?
I sit much like this. I try to have time in each day where I'm literally sitting almost in this position, but without distraction and thinking, so it's kind of it's almost meditative in some ways, except it's not true meditation, but I am thinking while not moving.
You're trying to structure your thoughts in that time.
Yeah,
Interesting.
Yeah. So, but everybody, as you say, is very different. And so with ADHD, you have, the key thing is we want to make sure that this is present across different domains of life, so school and home, to show that it really is a pervasive pattern and not something specific to the teacher or the home situation or something. And then you can help patients. It's interesting that ADHD is one of those disorders where people are trying to work on quantitative EEG-based diagnoses, and so there's some progress toward making a diagnosis with looking at particular externally detectable brainwave rhythms.
So skull cap with some electrodes that don't penetrate the skull.
That's right.
And this can be done in an hour or 2 hour session.
That's right.
Has to be done in the clinic, right?
Yeah, in the clinic, right? You have to have the right recording apparatus and so on. But that's in principle, as you increasing confidence comes in exactly which measurements, one could even imagine moving toward home tests, but we're not there yet.
Amazing. I think one of the reasons I get asked about it so much is a lot of people wonder if they have ADHD. Do you think that some of the lifestyle factors that inhabit us all these days could induce a subclinical or a clinical like ADHD? Meaning, if I look at people's phone use, including my own, and I don't think of it like addiction. It looks to me and feels to me more like OCD. And I'll come clean here by saying when I was younger, when I was a kid, I had a grunting tic. I used to hide it. I actually used to hide in the closet because my dad would make me stop. And I used to I couldn't feel any relief of my mind until I would do this. And actually now, if I get very tired, if I've been pushing long hours, it'll come back. I was not treated for it. But I will confess that I've had the experience of, I always liked sports where I involved a lot of impact. Fortunately not football, because I went to a high school where the football team was terrible. Maybe that would have avoided more impact. But things like skateboarding, boxing, they bring relief. I feel clarity after a head hit, which I avoid. But I used to say that's the only time I feel truly clear for a lot. And then eventually it dissipated. By about age 16, 17, it just disappeared. So I have great empathy for those that feel like there's something contained in them that won't allow them to focus on what they want to focus on. And these days, with the phone and all these email, etc., I wonder and I empathize a bit when I hear people saying, like, I think I might have ADHD or ADD. Do you think it's possible that our behaviors and our interaction with the sensory world, which is really what phones and email really are, could induce ADD or reactivate it?
This is a great question. I think about it a lot. There's, and you mentioned this tick-like behavior in yourself. It's very common that people who have tics have this building up of something that can only be relieved by executing the tick, which can be a motor movement or a vocalization or even a thought. And people do, I think these days, do have this. If they haven't checked their phone in a while, they do have a build up until they can check it and relieve it. And there's some similarities. There's a little reward that comes with the checking. But the key question in all of psychiatry, what we do is we don't diagnose something unless it's disrupting what we call social or occupational functioning. Like you could have any number of symptoms, but literally every psychiatric diagnosis requires that it has to be disrupting someone's social or occupational functioning. And these days, checking your phone is pretty adaptive. That pretty much helps your social and occupational functioning. And so we can't make it a psychiatric diagnosis. It's at least in the world of today.
I'd love your thoughts on psychedelic medicine, putting them into patients and seeing tremendous positive effects, but also tremendous examples of induced psychiatric illness. In other words, many people lost their minds as a consequence of overuse of psychedelics. I'll probably lose a few people out there, but I do want to talk about what is the state of these compounds. And I realize it's a huge category of compounds, but LSD and psilocybin, as I understand, trigger activation of particular serotonin receptor mechanisms, may or may not lead to more widespread activation of the brain, more that one wouldn't see otherwise. But when you look at the clinical and experimental literature, what is your sort of top contour sense of how effective these tools are going to be for treating depression?
Well, you're right to highlight both the opportunity and the peril that is there. And
like
of course we want to
everything
help
in
patients,
life.
and of course we want to explore anything that might be helpful, but we want to do it in a safe and rigorous way. But I do think we should explore these avenues. These are agents that alter reality and alter the experience of reality, I should say, in relatively precise ways. They do have problems. They can be addictive. They can cause lasting change that is not desirable. Now, That said, even as these medications exist now, as you know, there's an impulse to use them in very small doses and to use them as adjunctive treatments for the therapy of various kinds. And I'm also supportive of that if done, carefully and rigorously. Of course, there's risk, but there is risk with many other kinds of treatment, and I'm not sure that the risks for these medications vastly outweigh the risks that we normally tolerate in other branches of medicine.
Why would they work? I mean, let's say that indeed their main effect is to create more connectivity, at least in the moment, between brain areas. So psychedelics seem to be a trajectory not too far off from the dream state, where space and time are essentially not as rigid. And there is this element of synesthesia, blending of the senses, feeling colors and hearing light and things of that sort. You hear these reports anyway. Why would having that dreamlike experience somehow relieve depression long term? Do we have any idea why that might be?
We have some ideas and no deep understanding. One way I think about the psychedelics is they increase our willingness to increase the willingness of our brain to accept unlikely ways of constructing the world, unlikely hypotheses, as it were, as to what's going on. The brain, and particularly our cortex, I think, is a hypothesis generation and testing machine. It's coming up with models about everything. It's got a lot of bits of data coming in, and it's making models and updating the models and changing them, theories, hypotheses for what's going on. And some of those never reach our conscious mind. And this is something I talk about in projections in the book quite a bit, is many of these are filtered out before they get to our conscious mind, and that's good. We think how distracted we'd be if we were constantly having to evaluate all these hypotheses about what kinds of shapes or objects or processes were out there. And so a lot of this is handled before it gets to consciousness. What the psychedelics seem to do is they change the threshold for us to become aware of these incomplete hypotheses or wrong hypotheses or concepts that might be noise but are just wrong and so are never allowed to get into our conscious mind. Now, that's pretty interesting, and it goes wrong in psychiatric disorders. I think in schizophrenia, sometimes the paranoid delusions that people have are examples of these poor models that escape into the conscious mind and become accepted as reality, and they never should have gotten out there. Now, how could something like this, in the right way, help with something like depression? Patients with depression often are stuck. They can't look into the future world of possibilities as effectively. Everything seems hopeless, and what does that really mean? They discount the value of their own action. They discount the value of the world at giving rise to a future that matters. Everything seems to run out like a river just running out into a desert and drying up. And what these agents may do that increase the flow through circuitry, if you will, the percolation of activity through circuitry may end up doing for depression is increasing the escape of some tendrils of process of forward progression through the world. That's a concept. It's how I think about it. There are ways we can make that rigorous. We can indeed identify in the brain by recording. We can see cells that represent steps along a path and look into the future. And we can rigorously define these cells, and we can see if these are altered on psychedelics. And so that's one of the reasons that we're working with these agents in the laboratory to say, is this really the case? Are these opening up new paths or representations of paths into the future?
MDMA, ecstasy, is a unique compound in that it leads to big increases in brain levels of dopamine and serotonin simultaneously. And I realize that the neuromodulators like dopamine and serotonin often work in concert, not alone, the way they're commonly described in the, the more general popular discussions. However, it is a unique compound, and it's different than these serotonergic compounds like LSD and psilocybin. And there are now data still emerging that it might be, and in some cases can be useful for the treatment of trauma, PTSD, and similar things. Why would that work? And and a larger question, perhaps the more important question, is psychedelics, MDMA, LSD, all those compounds, in my mind, there are two components. There's the experience you have while you're on them, and then there's the effect they have after. People are generating variations of these compounds that are non-hallucinatory variations, but how crucial do you think it is to have, let's stay with MDMA, the experience of huge levels of dopamine, huge levels of serotonin, atypical levels of dopamine and serotonin released, having this highly abnormal experience in order to be normal again?
Yeah. I think the brain learns from those experiences. That's the way I see it. And so, for example, people who have taken MDMA, they will, as you say, they'll be the acute phase of being on the drug and experiencing this extreme connectedness with other people, for example.
Okay.
And then the drug wears off, but the brain learned from that experience. And so what people will report is, I'm not in that state, but I saw what was possible. I saw, you can. There don't need to be barriers, or at least not as many barriers as I thought. I can connect with more people in a way that is helpful.
Yes.
And so I think it's the learning that happens in that state that actually matters.
And this, as you described that sounds a lot like what I understand to be the hallmark feature of really good psychoanalysis, that the relationship between patient and therapist hopefully evolves to the point where these kinds of tests can be run within the context of that relationship and then exported to other relations. Is that
exactly
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah. And that probably, I'm assuming, is still the goal of really good psychiatry also.
It's a part of
Intimacy, really.
It should be when we have time. I think all good psychiatrists try to achieve that level of connection and learning. Try to help patients create a new model that is stable, that is learned, and that can help instruct future behavior.
One of the things that I took from reading your book, in addition to learning so much science and the future of psychiatry and brain science, was, amidst these in many cases very tragic cases and sadness, and a lot of the weight that puts on the clinician, on you also, that there's a central chord of optimism, that where we're headed is not just possible, but very likely and better.
Yeah.
And are you an optimist?
I am, and this is, by the way, this was a really interesting experience in writing Projections, because I had a dual goal. I wanted it to be for everybody, literally everybody in the world who wants to read it, and yet at the same time I wanted to stay absolutely rigorously close to the science, what was actually
Again,
known,
like a work of art.
when
They're
I'm
not
speaking about
mutually
science, when I'm
exclusive.
speaking about the neurobiology of the brain or psychiatry, I wanted to not have any of my scientific colleagues think, oh, he's coming too far, he's saying too much. And so I had these two goals which I kept in my mind the entire time, and a lot of this trying to find exactly the right word we talked about was on this path of staying excruciatingly rigorous in the science, and yet letting people see the hope, the where things were, and have everybody see that we've come a long way, we have a long way to go, but the trajectory and the path is beautiful. And so that was the goal. I think of course that sounds almost impossible to jointly satisfy those two goals, but I kept that in my mind the whole way through. And yes, I am optimistic, and I hope that came through in the book.
Well, it certainly did, and at least from this colleague, you you did achieve both. And
Yeah.
it's a wonderful, it's a masterful book, really, and one that, as a scientist and somebody who's a fellow brain explorer, hits all the marks of rigor and is incredibly interesting. And there's a ton of storytelling. Definitely check out the book. There are other people in our community that, of course, are going to be reaching out on your behalf. But it's incredible that you juggle this enormous number of things. Perhaps even more important, however, is that it's all in service to this larger thing of relieving suffering. So thank you so much for your time today, for the book and the work that went into the book. I can't even imagine, for the laboratory work and the development of channel ops and its clarity and all the related technologies, and for the clinical work you're doing and for sharing with us.
Well, thank you for all you're doing and reaching out. I'm very impressed by it. It's important and it's so valuable. And thank you for taking the time and for all your gracious words about the book. Thank you.